suicide and know it's not real, and here's who I can reach out to. And then for us as the help givers, any kind of help giver, you do not have to be a clinical psychologist, a mental health professional in any way. You gotta be someone who can listen. And it's not easy to listen to someone when they're telling you that they don't want to be alive anymore and you know all that they have to live for. They can't see it in that moment and their pain is very real. And they're not gonna get the gunk out, get that pain out, cut the isolation that they're feeling unless they can really talk to you. So I want us to spend some time today. I'm gonna go through some facts about suicide, kind of debunking some myths and misunderstanding about suicide, lead us into some skills about how we can have that conversation if you're worried about someone, and then some resources that you can leave with them too. On that note, I do work for a 988 center. I'm one of the clinical supervisors of our center here in Southern Louisiana, where we answer the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It is my job as the clinical lead there to oversee our best practices in suicide intervention and what we do when someone calls us. Those calls range from I'm upset, I don't really know how to explain my feelings, all the way to I've got a gun to my head. I have taken those calls and all the ones in between. And my entire career I've also spent in direct practice with those who have lost loved ones to suicide, which is the most unbelievable pain that somebody can go through. And it's what sparked me on my journey towards research and education to what can we do so we can stop this pain, this grief that people are going through that is unsurvivable. Starting out with just thinking about what a big issue this is, I start with this statistic about suicide death globally, that worldwide approximately one person dies by suicide about every 40 seconds. Not only is that significant because that's such a huge number, but think about it, this is the world. Suicide is affecting every race, every country, every culture, every religion, every socioeconomic class. It is basically the only thing in our world that does not discriminate. Suicide can affect anyone, and it is affecting almost everyone in some way, shape, or form. Here in our country, there's one death by suicide every 11.7 minutes, sometimes 11.2 minutes, depending on the day of the week, the month of the year. But you're looking at about 5 deaths every single hour, just in the US alone, from suicide. There is one suicide attempt every 32 seconds, which I want you to keep in mind as we're kind of building this concept of suicide death and living with thoughts of suicide and what that means. The attempt rate is much higher than the death rate. If you think about it this way, suicide is already a more leading cause of death than homicide. Most experts in homicide believe there's only about 3 survived homicides for every completed one, every actual attempt at homicide. For suicide, there's 25 to 100, depending on the age range. This is a much more prolific issue, but also has a higher survival rate if we can get to somebody in time. So nationally speaking, suicide is the 11th leading cause of death. This is our newest numbers from the CDC. We had seen a slight dip in suicide during COVID, those 2020 numbers, but then that has spiked right back up about 1, 2, 3 years past the initial pandemic, which historically speaking aligns with how suicide rates from your suicide attempt. But I really put this in here to note that all of these demographics are switching, and basically suicide rates are just raising amongst everyone. In particular, our young people, in particular our women, and in particular in the Black community. SAMHSA, the Substance and Mental Health Alliance nationally, has even started a national policy academy where they're getting teams from each state to get together to make strategic plans in all 50 states specific to Black suicide. Because the unfortunate part about it is that in Black communities, there used to be lower suicide rates, and we didn't study why. And now that the death rate is rising, we don't know what the cause is, and we don't know where the resiliency was before that. So when you hear things though that more women are dying by suicide, more young people, I want you to remember that that's that death rate by suicide. It doesn't necessarily mean that thoughts of suicide have risen. But we live in a day and age now, and it's one of the biggest ways you can keep your younger people safe, in which you can get any information from your phone. You can actually now find online the most lethal ways to attempt suicide. So before, where our younger people in particular were not dying from their first, second, even 5th suicide attempt, they now are, because they have the information online for what's going to be more likely to kill them when they do attempt suicide. So do our due diligence, teach our young people to report suicide content. It's illegal, it will get taken down. All social media platforms have specific ways to report suicide content. If you don't know it, you can call 988, we can tell you how. That's one of the biggest buffers we can have in just keeping some people safe. It won't solve the underlying issue of the mental health process, but can stop some lethal attempt rates. So in suicide, we use this picture of the iceberg a lot. What is the big picture? Because so often, just as I have been, we talk about suicide from the perspective of it as a cause of death, which is a big, high, scary number. Our latest numbers say that there were 48,183 suicide deaths annually in the U.S. But that, unfortunately, is actually just the tip of the iceberg. It's the most visible, it's what we talk about the most, it's big and scary, so you think it's the full picture, but there's a lot more lurking beneath the surface. So if we're to dig a little bit deeper, what we would find in this first layer here would be unreported suicide deaths. That's an additional 1,600 to 8,000 deaths a year. I know that's a breadth of numbers, but that's because it's unreported, so we have to do our best to guess. There's a lot of reasons why a suicide death might go unreported in census data as a suicide death. A lot of that has to do with the technicalities of a coroner's report. If there was no definite that this was intentional to take someone's life, something like an overdose or a car accident, even jumping/falling from a bridge would go down as an accidental death. And it's a bit of a myth that most people leave a suicide note behind when they die by suicide. It's more like 60 to 80% of suicide deaths, there is no note left behind. It's much more likely that someone leaves a note behind when they have attempted suicide and they thankfully survive. All suicide attempts are intents to end your own life. It is just really hard to end your own life. Our most basic feral instinct, every cell in our body is designed to keep us breathing. I mean, think about it. Even if you lose consciousness, you keep breathing. Your heart keeps beating. It's not easy. Someone gets to a place of overwhelming, what feels like physical pain when they get to the point where they attempt suicide and are able to actually lethally attempt. So there are many deaths by suicide where it's their fourth, fifth, sixth attempt when they've actually died. There is no real impulsivity in the traditional sense to a suicide death. Their suicide journey started well before, we just may not have known. And the only way that we can stop that is, again, big picture thinking, reducing the stigma around talking about suicide, and also making sure that suicide's not a bad word. It is the way that most people's brains work. And again, when we're digging deeper beneath this, we look at non-fatal suicide behaviors. That means a suicide attempt where somebody, again, thankfully survived. For elderly adults, there's 4 attempts for every 1 death. For adults, there are 25 attempts for every 1 death. And for our young people, there are 100 to 200 attempts for every 1 death by suicide. We just don't talk about it. It's buried in this iceberg. So when you're looking at this iceberg and this big scary number of 48,000, you have to then add an additional 8,000 to that. Then multiply that by 4, then multiply it by 25, then multiply it by 200. This iceberg that is suicide is much bigger than the already too scary and too big number of the death rate. But the biggest chunk of this iceberg and what we talk about the least are people who are living with thoughts of suicide. And that number is immeasurable. Again, most suicide theorists believe it's about 9 out of 10 people who at some point in their life will have some degree of a thought of suicide. Suicide ideation is on a spectrum. But again, that's not how we talk about suicide. We talk about it like it only happens to certain types of people or those types of people, which is a human response when we're afraid of something. We other it so that we think that we don't have to worry about it. Nobody wants to think that somebody that they care about could die in such a tragic way. But in that fear, we have actually created stigma, which is the barrier to people getting help. Because people are dying, and we don't talk about it enough, but more people are living. And we're talking about that even less, and that's where we have power still. Talking about suicide is what will save lives. By talking about suicide, you can destigmatize it, you can normalize it. I get some pushback on that word normalize. I don't mean encourage suicide attempts. I mean normalize the fact that people have thoughts of suicide. Look at the numbers we just went through. It is normal. Reduce fear, gain hope, and let others know they are not alone. What we're going to talk about today, what I hope the message I get across to you is that someone feeling alone and keeping it to themselves, that they are having thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore because they don't want to make others worry, because they don't want to be sent to a hospital, because they don't want to get told, oh, you shouldn't talk that way and feel dismissed. That causes a feeling of isolation that as it grows, activates the part of our brain that feels physical pain. So when I'm saying that someone gets to a point where they're in so much pain it feels unsurvivable, I mean that very literally, not metaphorically. And that's why the main thing that everybody can do is to break the stigma so we can all talk. Just the way as you can talk to somebody about having anxiety that day, feeling sad that day, grieving a loved one. All of these are brain issues. Brain's a part of our body just like anything else, and we need to talk about it like it is. We don't get to decide the way that our brain works. It works the way that it works, the way that God designed it. But you can learn how to live a wonderful, happy, healthy, loving life, feeling some control in the way your brain works if you get the right support, if you have the right support system in your personal life. And that can only happen when we reduce that stigma that's creating the barrier towards people getting help and towards people helping others. So we want to even be mindful of our language, of not using the term commit suicide. That's rooted in a lot of stigmatization. One from suicide being illegal, which it is still illegal on some law books. Don't ask me what that means, it just is. And also stigmatization beginning historically in the Catholic Church of suicide being deemed a mortal sin. I'm sure most of y'all have heard that. It no longer is, by the way. But that's where that term comes from, committing a sin, committing suicide. So instead, if we know someone has tragically died by suicide, it's just that. Suicide is a health issue that killed them inevitably before they could find the right type of support. Just like how cancer kills some people inevitably because you can't find the right treatment for it at the time. Someone dies by suicide, someone attempts suicide. We don't commit suicide. It's not an intentional act to hurt anybody else or even to hurt yourself. It's a survival instinct to get out of this pain that you cannot deal with anymore. So fear and shame are the foundations of that stigma. People feel they're being labeled as crazy, thought of as bad, or shut down. We shut people down with good intentions all the time. Don't say that, you've got a family, you're smart, you're going to school, you've got this career ahead of you, because we see everything that they have to live for. When someone's to the point where they need to come forward because they feel like they don't want to be alive anymore, they can't see that. So when we lead with, don't talk that way, we told someone not to talk to us about it, and they've got to get that gunk out to be able to survive it. That's the biggest thing that we can do is listen and let someone know, if you learn nothing else from today, just to be able to say, I'm so glad you're telling me this. You don't have to keep this to yourself. That's the biggest thing that you can do, because you cut through that isolation that they're feeling. That moment you make that connection, you cut through that isolation, you slice through that pain, you have deflated their ability to legally attempt suicide. We don't have to be experts, we don't always have to know what to say, but when we can actually listen, that's when we have a true connection with someone. You'll never be able to tell by the outside who's struggling. There are no universal warning signs when it comes to suicide, unless someone says, I'm having thoughts of suicide, you can trust them. Other than that, there are none. Someone has to feel comfortable to tell you, or you have to create a space where it's normal to ask and get a real explanation. That's the only way that you can end up having this real conversation to help someone and get them connected to care. I want to talk just briefly about stigmatization in the church. This is not a commentary on religion or faith. Faith is extremely important as a buffer against suicide if someone is a person of faith. That's huge. But I get asked about this a lot, so I did some research, and by research I mean I was reading a book and it happened to be in there, thankfully, about where this came from, especially people who are grieving, of fearing that their loved ones go to hell if they were to die by suicide. So this is historical data. If we think back to 8th grade world history, Catholic churches were the ruling body of the time. So this is why it has such a widespread reach as kind of a myth and stigma surrounding suicide. So suicide is mentioned in the Bible a few times, with no sort of condemnation coming from the Bible. We did see this speak of suicide being a sin from the Catholic Church around 345 to 430 AD, with the resurgence with St. Thomas Aquinas around 1245 AD. So essentially suicide was declared a mortal sin, stating that this is a choice that appropriates God's power over life and death. Meaning this is a sin because you're deciding when you die rather than letting God decide when you die. However, what we know now, which is why I have choice in quotation marks, is that suicide is not a logical choice. You don't make a pros and cons list and then just decide to kill yourself. Suicide is a survival instinct. It's literally your fight or flight response kicking in to get you out of this pain that feels unsurvivable. That's how suicide attempts happen. But nobody declared this because they wanted to punish people. People were afraid. Catholic Church didn't want people in their communities dying by suicide. So you think, okay, well, if you tell someone you're going to go to hell if you die by suicide, who's going to kill themselves? Actually, all that did was separate people, because faith is hugely important, and you can't stop thoughts of suicide. You can learn that your brain is lying to you, just like someone with anxiety can or depression can, but those thoughts are going to be there. You can just have more control over them to have a huge, healthy life and know that your brain is lying to you and know where your supports are. However, if we are to give the message that God has to separate himself from you because of the thoughts you're having, you're cutting someone off from their faith. You're increasing that feeling of isolation. And that has been studied and shown that that increases suicide rates and suicide death pretty directly. So we need to be sure we are encouraging faith and letting people know God, or their higher power as they define it, is right there with them when they're struggling. It is not something to be ashamed of. It is something that you should be proud of yourself for being able to be introspective enough and brave enough to come forward and talk about, because it is happening to most people and we just don't talk about it that way. Belief that you're not alone is what decreases risk. So just to break y'all down a little bit with what the suicide process is in the brain, just trying to give y'all kind of a deeper understanding, is that what will happen is that somebody has their first thought of suicide. It usually starts pretty mild with something like, I wouldn't care if I didn't wake up tomorrow. Tomorrow seems too big. I wouldn't care if I died in my sleep. I wouldn't care if a bus hit me. I don't want to wake up. You know, these type of messages. And yet we will always try and label that as something like a mild thought of suicide, or not really thoughts of suicide. And it's like, it is. It's okay. You can just say that. Because what will happen is that someone will not accept that it's a thought of suicide, and they'll either bury it, keep it completely internalized and not talk about it, or they will have this thought to themselves of, well, I can't tell anybody about this, they're going to think I'm crazy, or I don't want people to worry about me. So they're keeping it to themselves. That's an isolation. It's what we call in suicidology terms a thwarted sense of belongingness. You're feeling cut off from others around you. So when you isolate this suicide ideation, these thoughts of suicide, they begin to grow and they take up more space in your mind. So think of it like a tumor that's growing. It's not a tumor, but metaphorical tumor. As these thoughts grow, they get to twist your perception of your reality. So that thought that started as I don't want to bum people out, I don't want them to be worried about me, now starts to grow into, I'm not good enough. I don't give anything to anybody else. I'm ineffective, I'm incompetent, I don't give anything to anybody, they'd be better off without me. So you start to isolate more. Now this isolation you can often not see from the outside. I just heard these tragic stories of these wonderful people who nobody knew were struggling, and that's most often what happens. And so this isolation, is internal. You're internally isolating a part of yourself. What we know now from brain mapping is that this feeling of isolation, when it gets so big, it activates the part of our brain that feels physical pain. That's that pain that begins to feel unsurvivable, and it's now matched with a part of your brain that's lying to you saying everybody's going to be better off without you. How do you survive that? There is no way to survive that. You feel like you are on fire. And I, again, mean that very literally. The client told it to me that way one time. They put it this way, where when you think about the footage of 9/11 and people were stuck at the top of the towers, they were jumping off, they were jumping out. They were ending their own lives. They were dying by their own hand, by suicide. Not in the traditional sense, but it was suicide. We all understood that. They were dying, they were suffering, they were choking on smoke, they were burning. It feels the exact same for someone who's struggling with suicide ideation in the traditional way we think about it. We just can't see the flames. But that's what they're dealing with, and again, with their brain getting to a point where it is completely lying to them and saying, everybody's gonna be better off without you. That's why you see so many doctors die by suicide, so many mental health professionals die by suicide, wonderful college students, leaders, church leaders die by suicide. A lot of people go into helping professions that are struggling internally to try and bring some light to themselves. And that also can end up cutting them off from ever speaking about what they're really going through. They're kind of masking the pain by helping others, which is a wonderful thing to do, but everybody needs help from someone else. And we can only do that, again, by not making suicide a dirty word. You're not weak if you have thoughts of suicide. It's the way your brain works. We wouldn't call someone weak for having asthma and needing to use their inhaler. It's the way their lungs work. It's the same thing. The brain is an organ in our body. Mental health is physical health. It's the way that your brain works. And we can all do the right thing by destigmatizing that and letting people know, talk to me, because that's how we're going to save lives. This is just a quick breakdown. I won't spend too long on the clinical stuff with y'all, but if anybody wants to learn more about this process of the difference between thoughts of suicide and how that builds to a capability for a suicide attempt, I highly recommend Thomas Joyner. He wrote the Interpersonal Psychological Theory of Suicide, which is the most universally agreed upon theory of suicide. He's still alive. He just wrote a new book that I'm in the middle of reading. But his first book, called Why People Die by Suicide, really breaks this down in a very understandable way. He's a loss survivor himself. His father died by suicide, and then he is now a suicidologist and professor. And it's a really easy read that really kind of helps to understand. So again, why people die by suicide, if anybody wants to read anymore. But what he broke down here in his theory of suicide is the difference between thoughts of suicide, which would be that desire for death, versus capability of actually attempting suicide. We're not born with the ability to end our own lives. We are born with the instinct desire to preserve our lives. There are steps that build up to being capable to actually attempting suicide, and then again, even more towards being able to actually die by suicide. So you want to separate these two things in your mind. Thoughts of suicide are like a chronic, lifelong illness, the way that the brain works. I'm going to love the term illness. Just chronic, lifelong thing that someone's going to be dealing with. When I say lifelong, that doesn't mean that someone that has thoughts of suicide is going to have intense thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore every single day. It just means that's the way their brain works. At some points in life, for some people it stays very mild and might only pop up every decade or so. For some people it is more intense and it grows more quickly. It's different for different people, but it's just the way their brain works, and we don't have to stop that. We just need people to be able to talk about it and find the supports that work for them so that we stop this building of capability. Capability is how able is someone to actually attempt suicide. And there's a lot of processes people may go through to start building towards this capability. And these are subtle things that you actually can be on the lookout a little bit more for. Things like a preoccupation with death. It can look different. It can be like watching Netflix documentaries about the Black Plague or other, forms of death. Reading Sylvia Plath poetry, like really kind of digging into things that would make you lose your fear of death. Painful, provocative experiences, as Thomas Joyner calls them. That can be things like substance use that would push you away from your friends and family, homelessness, things of isolation that might not look as normal as they seem, failing your classes, withdrawing from the cheerleading squad, from the soccer team. Painful and provocative experiences are basically just defined as anything that's sort of pushing you away from your instinctual desire to preserve your own life. That's what builds capability towards feeling like I am going to attempt suicide because I'm more aligned with death now than life, and also I feel competent in how I'm going to attempt suicide. People will typically attempt suicide first with a method that they're very familiar with. That's why you see a lot of more times with young people. It might be like medication that they're already prescribed. You also, things trend in schools. You'll see that. One of the more recent trends being hanging in school bathrooms by their school IDs or their school sweatshirt. I had to learn when I was working on crisis chat, it was about 7 years ago, it was the term hot bagging. That was what was trending that year. It was intentional suffocation with a bag over your head. With our young people, these methods do trend because they feel comfortable with it. It's a trend just like anything else. So we need to be on the lookout. We need to have our ears open and really understanding this is something that's affecting our young people. But attempt windows. Those can look different on different people, but typically someone's going to enter into an intense state of agitation. Even if you can't see it from the outside, it's an agitated brain. It's your crisis moment. It's your fight or flight moment. It means your brain has switched off of your parasympathetic nervous system, having all of your brain receiving electricity, and is operating under cognitive constriction, meaning I'm in my fight or flight mode. My part of my brain that understands my mortality, that understands the consequences and long-term repercussions of decisions is not getting electricity when I'm in this crisis mode. That's when attempts happen. That's why when you hear someone who dies by suicide, let's say that they caused a car accident and other people got hurt, and you think, why would they risk other people's lives if they were only trying to end their own? The part of the brain that would recognize that is not getting electricity in a crisis window when your fight or flight response is on. Your brain goes into tunnel vision. So attempt windows, if that's what you're working with, someone's actively in that moment where they're going to attempt suicide, all you need to do is get them talking. You need to get them talking about their dog, about football, about whatever it may be. When you get someone talking, and it's a a lot of different techniques in de-escalation you can learn, like active listening and things like that, that we don't have time for today. I'd love to teach y'all if you ever want. When you get someone talking, they have to use the more higher level thinking part of their brain. If you click on the higher level thinking part of the brain, you click off fight or flight mode. You can only have one or the other operating. So that's what you really need to do. Don't ask someone what they have to live for. Don't try and tell them about their mom that loves them so much. Their logic is twisted in that moment. Whenever that happens, they're gonna be better off without me. They'll be sad, but they'll be okay. And they're gonna be feeling judged by you. What you need to do is just get them talking. Tell me what happened today. How did you get here? How did you get to the bridge? What's going on? Tell me, what you did yesterday. Get someone word vomiting. It will de-escalate them, and then when you de-escalate someone, you really cut through their ability to actually lethally attempt in that moment. You don't want to be too directive. If you were to yell or something like that, you would escalate someone. Fight or flight mode is on. That's a defensive technique. You want to be very collaborative. As Sam just right. Think about hostage negotiations in movies. How they're always like, we'll get you whatever you want, your pizza and your plane to Aruba and all of that. It's because it gets that person talking and feeling like they're on the same side, which de-escalates people. That's what you need to, hopefully none of y'all are in a position where you're actively with someone in attempt mode, but if I can leave you with one nugget, it's that get them talking and don't ask them what they have to live for, because that's not gonna get you anywhere. A word on these warning signs versus risk factors. Again, don't put too much pressure on yourself to think that you're gonna be able to see who's struggling. You can't. There are no universal warning signs. If we could see it that easily, we would stop people. There are specific risk factors that apply to different demographics. We don't have as much time to go through all of these today. But essentially a risk factor just means that because of what someone has gone through, or a demographic they may align in, or a life experience, that it either would intensify their thoughts of suicide or increase their ability to attempt suicide. It doesn't cause thoughts of suicide. There is no causal link to what causes thoughts of suicide. That has been studied. There are a billion correlations. Name a subject, I can tell you how it correlates to suicide. There is no cause that we can find. Just like we can't find a root cause of why someone would have schizophrenia, why someone would have anxiety disorders. It's the way your brain works. All of you who choose to volunteer and use your time to mentor people and connect with people are superheroes, but you cannot be a superhuman. You cannot be omnipotent. You cannot read people's minds. But what you can do is create the space to where if someone doesn't even know the exact words of what they need to express, they feel like they can come to you and you're gonna give them the time. You're not gonna stop them, you're not gonna cut them off, you're gonna let them talk and you're gonna listen to them. That's the biggest thing that you can do. Because you can't be limited by any list. Suicide can happen to anyone and everyone. Some of you in this room have struggled with it if you're not struggling with it right now. You can't tell from the outside, so don't try and get yourself stressed out trying to find the exact warning signs or lists. Most suicide theorists and suicidologists will tell you that doesn't exist. In fact, they can be quite limited. When you see things like articles that say, like, if your loved one demonstrates 12 out of these 15 signs, then they're at risk for suicide. Those have been proven to have very little efficacy and actually increase risk because it increases stigmatization, and it also a student who died by suicide, grief journey after their daughter had died by suicide, and they wrote an article about it in her church's newsletter, in my volunteer's church's newsletter. And she read it and thought the article was pretty good, but smack dab in the middle was one of those lists. Here's 10 signs that someone could be at risk for suicide, and she was so hurt. She was like, do you think if my son looked like this obvious list of signs, I wouldn't have known something was wrong? She's like, my son volunteered with the Boy Scouts. He volunteered with his church. He ate dinner with me every night. He seemed happy. I didn't know he was struggling. How dare they publish this list and make it seem like this is what suicide looks like? It does sometimes, but not always. Think about celebrity deaths. Think of Kurt Cobain versus Robin Williams. Those did not look the same, but it's the same thing that killed them. So don't stress yourself out thinking you have to be able to tell from the outside. All you can do is create that space where someone feels comfortable coming to you, and a lot of that depends on our everyday language. If offhanded I hear someone talk about how suicide is selfish, or even use the term commit suicide or anything like that, I'm not gonna go talk to them about what I'm struggling with. I'm gonna think they're gonna judge me. And you're already feeling hypercritical and judged because of the way suicide ideation affects your brain. So the biggest thing that we can do, again, I've said it 7,000 times, but I mean it 7,000 times, is just get comfortable leaning in and listening, and then creating those safety plans with someone if that's what you need. Most of the time you don't need an intense safety plan, but you can leave someone with some tools for what they can do. The most effective skill is to be comfortable talking and more comfortable listening. When they've done studies of suicide assessment tools and things like that, they're all fine. They're documentation. That's what they should be used as. You don't need to think that you need to get some sort of suicide risk assessment and know how to use it. Conversation has been proven in studies to be a much more effective tool than any suicide risk assessment, because you've got to get the real information. Because if you think about it, if someone were to come to me, when I'm volunteering with a group and they say, I'm having thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore, and I said, okay, let me get out this checklist and we'll go through it together. And I ask them a bunch of yes or no questions. I'm not going to get the story. They're not going to tell me what's really going on. Like if you think about when you go to the doctor, this is true for me and I believe it's true for most people, and the nurse is with you in the beginning and they're asking you those questions that you don't always want to answer about, like how much did you exercise, how much did you eat fast food, how much alcohol do you drink, do you ever smoke? Everybody lies a little bit sometimes because you want to give the answer that they are expecting. And it's the same if we're to use any sort of checklist. So, but again, your biggest tool is just to be able to open the door and say, are you having thoughts of suicide? I'm worried about you. Here's some changes I've noticed. We can just check in with each other. That's the biggest thing you can do. And then to have an engaging conversation, not asking a bunch of questions, validating someone's emotions. Now, validating emotions does not mean validating their thoughts. You don't have to validate, like, yes, it makes sense that you'd want to die, but you can validate the underlying emotions in that. I hear that you're going through pain. I hear right now that you're feeling alone. I hear right now that you're feeling sad, and validate that for someone. And they're going to give you the information that you need when you get them talking. Sure. So remember, it's not a bunch of question answers, because that's not how we talk to people. Like if you call up your best friend, they're not just asking you questions and you're answering. And dig into those emotions. And again, if anything, just say, I'm so glad you're talking to me about this. You can even be honest and say, it's scary for me and I imagine it's scary for you, but I want you to talk to me. That's the biggest thing that you can do to be able to help somebody. So one of the biggest steps towards being able to have this conversation will sometimes be that you have to ask, and you have to ask directly. I'm sure all of you have heard that, or most of you, that if you're asking about suicide, you need to say the word suicide, and you need to say those words directly and comfortably with someone. But you don't want to just out of the blue say like, hey, are you having thoughts of suicide? Because it's a big personal question. If someone came up and asked me out of the blue, I would panic at first. But you can say like, hey, I just want to check in with you. I've noticed that, you haven't been going to class as much, or I've noticed that you seemed a little down the last few times I checked in with you. That's completely okay. I just want to check in if you're okay. The battery checks like y'all were talking about, that's a huge thing to be able to do. But then if someone's being kind of evasive, you can just say, I just want to check in with you directly. Only tell me what you're comfortable with. Have you been having thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore? Have you been having thoughts of suicide? That's the only way to definitively be able to know if that's what someone's going through. Is if they can say the words, yes, I'm having thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore. Yes, I'm having thoughts of suicide. You want to use these words too. You don't want to say hurting or harming yourself, and you don't want to ask in the negative. When we get nervous as humans, we tend to ask in the negative, where you say, you're not having thoughts of doing something, are you? No one's going to answer you truthfully if we ask that way, because it's like, well, they clearly want me to say no. But if we were to ask openly and honestly, we're okay with this, I'm comfortable, that's why I'm saying these words to you, and I'm going to give you space to answer. You don't have to answer me right away. I can sit with you in some silence, but I'm right here with you. That's what's going to give you your best bet towards someone giving you a real answer. Even just saying, when I worked on the phone lines, I worked on them for about 2 years on the suicide prevention line, I would even just say if I just needed an in to be able to ask someone, hey, I just want to check in with you. I know you've mentioned you had a lot going on right now, XYZ, whatever that is. While you've been stressed with this, have you been having thoughts of suicide? Or even normalizing it, saying, I just want to check in with you now. When some people have been going through their parents getting divorced or losing their job, whatever it may be that they're going through, they might find that they're having thoughts about not wanting to wake up the next day or not wanting to be alive anymore. Is that what you're going through? When we normalize it or make it personal, it makes it so much more comfortable to be able to answer. So these are some tools that you can use if you're like, I didn't ask the question because they're not coming out and telling me. Use the word suicide. Use the words killing yourself. Don't jump to, are you thinking of killing yourself? Because you can be having thoughts of suicide without actively be planning a suicide attempt. Remember, those are two different things. So you can ask someone, if you ask them first, are you thinking of attempting suicide? They can tell you no, and you might be like, whew, that doesn't mean that they're not having thoughts of suicide. So ask what you mean and build to it, and just let people know, I just want to check in. And don't pressure them for an answer. If they're like, I don't want to talk, and they kind of clam up, and say, hey, it's okay. I'm here if you ever want to talk, just know that. And you've created that space. You've created that safe space for them, and that's all you can do. We can't force people to talk, but we can let them know when they're ready, here's where they can go. When you are having a conversation with someone and you're trying to kind of understand where do I go to next, here's what you're going to be listening for, because here's just a quick kind of guide I'm going to give you through of how you can kind of structure this conversation. Get them talking, what they've been going through, what's been stressing them out, and mentally be taking some notes in your head about what is it that they're feeling the pressure about. And you need to be able to validate those emotions. Don't say, it's just a test. That's not going to be helpful. But make that note in your head. They're worried about their test. But you're also going to be listening for or knowing what are things that have them still alive. Everybody that is still breathing who has thoughts of suicide has what we call suicide ambivalence, meaning there's a part of them that wants to die, but there is some part of them that wants to be alive. If they didn't, they would be dead. That's harsh, but that is the truth. That's why you see so often people pacing on the bridge, or they've posted something on Facebook, or they call a suicide line, even though the gun's in their hand. It's because that brain is fighting to want to be attached to life, and there's some reason, even if it's just our innate basic instinct. And that's what we want to help someone to be able to acknowledge, but you've got to be able to acknowledge both. You're not going to twist someone into thinking they don't want to die anymore. That's still there. But you can help them acknowledge that there's both. So you're also going to be listening for what has them living. Don't ask a whole bunch of questions about that, just listen. Or if you know them, you may know a few things. But the trick to this is you don't want to jump on it and say, what about your mom, what about your dog, whatever. That's not going to help. But if they mention a dog, like pets are huge. If they mention a dog, let's say, man, it sounds like you love your dog. You're acknowledging their attachment to something in life, not the other way around. Because remember, they are feeling that burdenness. They don't feel like they're a good son, a good brother, whatever it is. But you can help them acknowledge that attachment they have to their brother, to their dog, to their school, whatever it is. So rather than saying, what would it be like for your brother if you died? Instead saying, it sounds like you really love your brother. That's going to be lighting that attachment that's keeping them here on earth still. And then we're going to build from there. You want to hear their whole story. There's no time limits when you're having a thought about suicide. Do not jump to hospitalization. Hospitalization through the emergency room is really the last resort you want to have, and that's because you've talked to someone, you're with them, they're going to kill themselves today, and I mean today, and there's nothing you can do about it. Because if we remember, suicide attempts happen in those crisis moments. Your brain can only operate in crisis mode for a day. So if they're talking about attempting suicide a week from now, there's no need for the hospital because they're just going to hold them for 3 days and then release them. What if we stop? Hospitalization through the emergency room is because of a physical threat. So if they're going to kill themselves that day and you can't stop them, yes, the emergency room is likely necessary. If that's not the case, there's no reason to put someone in the emergency room. It can be quite harmful, in fact. Most suicide deaths, that person presented to the emergency department at some point in the year before their death. It's a pretty stigmatizing experience, and it's not mental health. It's not the hospital's fault. It's not what they're there for. They don't have the capacity for that. It's not mental health in response to suicide, ideation. They're there and can keep you physically safe if you're going to kill yourself that day, most of the time, not all of the time. But so just remember that. Don't jump to trying to convince someone to go to the hospital. That's only because you're going to attempt suicide today. You know with what and you know when, and I can't stop them. So, suicide risk assessments, all that type of stuff, which I won't go into with y'all today, can help you determine your risk level for y'all's purposes. You just want to be able to know, is there a risk for attempting today or not? But your biggest tool, again, is going to be, I am listening to their full story, because I'm going to use their full story to build to what we're going to call an ambivalent statement. So things that you're listening for are suicide desire. How intense is their desire to not want to be alive anymore? Suicide capability, mostly for like a conversation with, do they have a method that they think that they're going to use? Because if so, you want to incorporate that into a safety plan. Most people have their method of choice. You don't just flip-flop on it, so I'm going to teach you how you can put some safety measures in place for that. And then intent. This is the information you'll have to ask directly is, do you have a plan for how you're going to attempt, and do you know with what? If someone says, well, sometimes I think of driving off a bridge, or sometimes I think of drinking bleach, that's not intent. That's thoughts in their brain, and that's okay. Someone who has intent, imminent risk as we call it, where the hospital might be necessary, it is, I'm going to kill myself today when my mom leaves for the grocery store, when, when I get out of school, they'll know when and with what that method is chosen. And that's when maybe the ER is necessary, but that's something you want to check on directly, but ideally you have a little time to build some rapport first. So your conversation is not about taking away the pain. You're not going to be able to take away that pain in one conversation. What you can do is slice through that isolation that's causing the unsurvivable amount of pain. You're helping someone to lean into knowing, I get to have support while I'm feeling this way. I don't have to change the way I'm feeling. In fact, I can feel exactly how I am and someone's down on the floor with me. That is what can save a life. So this conversation is about listening and validating and helping someone to know right now you may really feel like you want to die, but you can choose to keep yourself alive, and I'm going to help you with that. And then we'll get connected to longer term support once we make it past this initial conversation of pain. So I'm going to move through these slides pretty quickly. That's really more about a risk assessment, but what you're trying to build to is helping them to understand what their buffers are. You're hearing the whole story. They get to tell you whatever they want. You're validating their emotion, saying, I'm so glad you're talking to me, and you are listening and engaging in their buffers. Now, buffers are what are those attachments to life, like we talked about. When suicide pain is so overwhelming and twisting your thoughts, you may not be able to see or acknowledge your buffers. So we're building to a point where I'm going to be your mirror and help reflect to you what actually has you living. But you're only going to trust me with that if I acknowledge the buffer. So you're building to the crescendo of your conversation, where your conversation is going to hit a point, and then that's how you can move in to resources, to safety planning, what we're doing next, is to hear the whole story and then create what we call an ambivalent statement. Ambivalent statements are built upon the structures of nonviolent communication and active listening, which essentially means I'm going to paraphrase back to you what you have told me, so you believe me when I'm saying this, and I'm going to help you realize that that's a part of you that wants to die and a part of you that wants to live. So you're going to say to someone, we've been talking, and I've heard that you are not doing as well in your class as you want to be, your mom's grounding you, and you can't go to the dance, and your girlfriend broke up with you, and that's the part of you that wants to die. I also heard about how much you love your job and how much you're looking forward to the soccer tournament, and that's the part of you that wants to live. So while there's a part of you that wants to die, there is also a part of you that does want to live. It's both. We're acknowledging both. That's the only way they'll have buy-in to what you're saying. Even in more extreme cases, I get it. I hear it. You've been kicked out of the house, you're feeling alone, you don't know where you're gonna go, and you feel like nobody cares. And that part of you wants to die. But you're here right now with me and you're talking to me. And I'm so glad that you are, because that's the part of you that wants to live. So while there's a part of you that wants to die, there's also a part of you that wants to live. You can always create an ambivalent statement because they're right there with you, talking to you in that moment. And most of the time, this is gonna work. Someone's gonna say, yeah, I guess. How can they not? You're repeating back to them what they've said or what you know about them. So it's a very, very powerful tool that then you can say, okay, let's take care of that part of you that wants to live just for today. It's always short term in this initial conversation. And I'm gonna check back in with you tomorrow and we're gonna figure out where we're gonna go from there. Now sometimes this isn't gonna work. You don't need to freak out. We can just focus on safety. If someone has some safety issues, maybe they're thinking about how they'll attempt whatever that may be, you can just say, I get it. You wanna die right now, that is very real, but I care about you and we're here together and I wanna help. Can we make a plan to take care of you and keep you safe just for today? And most of the time, if you're breaking it down into that 12, 24 hours, someone's gonna say yes. They're gonna say, okay, let's make a plan. And that's all you need, because then you're getting someone out of that crisis window, or you build someone into a place where they trust you and they know you're not jumping to extremes and you really heard them. You've made that interpersonal connection. That connection sliced the isolation, it sliced the pain. So if you want to create kind of a safety plan, what someone's going to do, even if it's because you just had an emotional conversation, let's talk about how you're going to go home and take care of yourself tonight. You always want to do that, create that plan for the night into the next day, whatever the time frame is, and then who's following up from there. Am I calling you? Are you calling your mom? Whatever it is, like someone has to follow up from there. Follow-up has been proven to reduce suicide risk by 86% or so in the studies that they do. It's 80-something in different studies that they've shown. Even when it's just text, someone in the samples they've done, someone texting just saying, glad we got to talk, reduce suicide risk. So you want to remember, if you're helping someone to create a plan to kind of cope through the next day, especially if you're not going to be with them, suicide is a coping mechanism. We don't take coping mechanisms away without putting others in place. So if you're taking away coping mechanisms, like thinking about how they'll attempt or reducing their access to their method, you got to put others in place. So what are they going to do? You don't only want to take things away. That's not helpful. We want to give autonomy. We want to give power. What are you going to do as well? Are you going to call your best friend, even if it's just a chit chat? Are you going to go for a walk? Are you going to watch that Netflix comedy special? Whatever it is, put in some other tools in place. Things you want to check on, are they ready to talk to anybody else? Do they want to call anybody with you to get the conversation going? Can someone physically be with them when they go home, even if they don't want to tell them yet what they're going through? And help arrange that together. The biggest thing, if they have a method that they're going to use, even if they're not planning on attempting, but they mention, yeah, I've thought about slitting my wrist or whatever that may be, you want to practice what we call means restriction, which has been proven to reduce suicide rates in the communities that practice it. Ideally, you'd want someone to throw away or get rid of what they would use. That's rarely going to happen. It's kind of a comfort totem now. What you can do is reduce their access to it. So let's say it's pills. Can you go lock the pills in the trunk of a car and then throw the keys into a messy closet? Can you go put them on this high cabinet and then put the stool that you would use in another room? Can you go lock the gun in the shed? Can you freeze bullets? We've had someone do before. Anything that's going to put steps in between having that immediate access to their method. That works for two ways. One, having to think through the steps of how to find something activates your higher level of thinking, deactivates your fight or flight mode should you be in that crisis mode. That deflates capability for an attempt. Also, having this longer process of trying to dig through everything and you're having to go through cause and effect, that has your brain also then thinking of what is the effect of this attempt. Also gives you more time that someone might find you if they know where you've hidden something or you've locked something away. So it's gone a huge way towards reducing suicide deaths and suicide attempts exponentially in communities that practice means restriction. You want to think of some relaxation, some coping, some distraction, and follow-up. And safety contracts. Now, safety contracts do not mean I promise not to attempt suicide. It doesn't work. But what you can do is say, if after I'm gone, after our conversation, if these thoughts pop back up, if they're feeling overwhelming or you're thinking like you're going to attempt, what will you do? What are you going to do? You always want to remember we're being proactive. And there are some options I'm going to give y'all after this next slide of what are some things that they can put into their safety plan. Is it 988? Is it an app? Is it calling people? Is it calling you? They can think it through. There's a lot of options. But most of all, change your conversation. You're empowering individuals to believe, one, that they get support in times where they're feeling low and maybe unworthy of it, but that they can also choose to keep themselves alive, even though their brain is lying at them, that they should die. We're not shying away from talking about suicide, but you're supporting others when they're experiencing times of suicide ideation and pain, normalizing, destigmatizing to instill hope. Now here are a few national resources that you can use. They can go into someone's safety plan or just have them so that the people you work with, the people that you love know. 211 is an information and referral line for health and human services. So you can dial 211 from your phone or you can text your zip code to 898-211 and get connected to a live resource specialist. So again, that's not going to be for that crisis intervention, but for your follow-up, so that you can reduce some of the stressors rather than having to Google and find what's available in your area. There's a compassionate person who works for a 211 center who can hear your need. You don't have to know the exact terms of what you're looking for and let you know what's available. Now that can be behavioral health resources. It can also be things like, where's the nearest food pantry? Who's offering utility assistance? Where's their homelessness assistance? Things like that. Health and human services, reducing the stressors. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, again, available nationwide. That's 988. 988, 3-digit dialing code. The 10-digit one, 1-800-273-TALK, still works, but it's easy to remember, 988. You can also text 988. So you're going to get connected to a live resource specialist, live crisis intervention specialist. We all have to be accredited by various entities, like we're accredited by the American Association of Suicidology. You have to pass your application with Vibrant and SAMHSA to be a 988 contact center. You'll get routed to your local one based upon the area code of the phone you are dialing from. You can text the word HOME to 741-741. That's a national crisis text line. If I didn't say this already, you can also text 988 now too, which is pretty cool. You want to give texting options to your younger people. Nobody wants to talk on the phone. So texting the word HOME, 741-741. All of these too, you're getting a live person. It's never a bot. There's also an app sponsored by the Lifeline. It's free. It's called My3, MY numerical 3. That's a free safety planning app. You can have that on your phone. It can have what your activators are. It can have what your stressors are in there, and it has your safety plan in there. And it has a big red button to call 988 or call 911 if that's what you need. So you can put in there the people that you feel comfortable calling. Sometimes you can't always remember when your brain is jumbled and you're feeling stressed. So it holds your safety plan and it holds your resources in there. It's a great app, and again, it's free. So that's always nice. For survivors of suicide loss, because post-eviction is prevention, suicide is cyclical, you can visit the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP.org. They have a list of support groups for survivors, also other programs for survivors like Healing Conversations. It's also great for the suicide prevention causes. There are state chapters and local chapters. They do Out of Darkness walks regionally. They have things like the statistics in your state on suicide if you ever need some data, and just wonderful ways that you can get involved or that you can learn more. AFSP is a great resource. So I know that's a lot. I shoved at y'all really quick, and I also know I talk really fast, but I thank y'all for your time, and I'm here if anybody has any questions.
Will you be passing on your presentation?
Sure. Are you able to share? Yes, Dr. Alexander has it, and he'll share it. Yes.
You mentioned not immediately going to the emergency rooms. If you're in a community where you have a resource like in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, we have Western Psych, which is part of the UPMC health system that is specifically for mental health. Is that a resource that we may want to engage at that point, or we're still dealing with your guidelines?
It's going to be different for different regions and what they have available. Standard rule of thumb is that you want to go with the most non-invasive level of care. So that's why that conversation is going to be really helpful. If it is something that seems like more of a crisis, but you know that you want to avoid the ER, if there's crisis community walk-in centers or mental health facilities with 24-hour care, that's going to be much better than the emergency room. But you want to make sure, is that really necessary? Does this person need, because they're going to get held and watched no matter where you take them. So is that what this person needs at this point? Because I'm worried they're going to attempt. If they're not really in that attempt window, it's usually something where follow-up and maybe getting them connected to like a counselor or like a outpatient program is going to be better. Err on the side of caution. Always physical safety comes first, but your least invasive level of care is usually what you want to aim for, rule of thumb.
I'm just thinking in general, because we're probably going to come from a perspective of where's our comfort level? Are we comfortable leaving that person after having this conversation?
Yeah. And it's always scary. Believe me, we always feel that way on the Lifeline, and we don't get to know what happens to people after they get off of the phone with us. But what we do, rest assured in, is knowing that when we haven't pushed someone into a level of care that they're not ready for or comfortable with, that actually decreases their risk. When you kind of force someone into care and into being held, that can increase risk if it wasn't what they were ready for yet. So that's something you just kind of want to let yourself know. And by the way, people have killed themselves in mental health facilities, so there's no guarantee. But keep your own comfort level, have an honest conversation, and then if you know I'm calling you tomorrow, you call me if you need me before tomorrow. That's the biggest thing you can do, and a lot of your conversations are not going to involve a really intense attempt risk. But if they do, err on the side of caution, but be real with them. Be like, I don't know how to know that you're going to be safe. Can we do this? Will you do this for me? Is going to be kind of a lot better than like being vague, and I think this can help you type of thing. Through 988? So through 988, if you dial the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we are always going to ask if you would like a follow-up call the next day. You can decline or you cannot answer. When we do call, we also provide automated follow-up, which is basically if I'm not comfortable with you just calling me, it's going to be a text, an automated text that just says, hey, we're checking in. Do you need a call back? If not, remember that we're always here. So that would be the level of follow-up. But if someone says, yes, I'd like you to call me back tomorrow, and they can always call us back at any time, which we remind people, we'll call them back, say, hey, you called us yesterday, we're just checking in on how you're doing, and if they need a full other hour conversation, we're there for that too. There's no time limits on 988 either, by the way. Or if they're like, no, I'm feeling a lot better, could we look at resources available or things like that? We'll take their lead in what that follow-up conversation is going to look like. That's actually a really good question too, because we do get asked a lot about like what happens when you call 988, and I can't really say because it's different for everybody. There's no agenda. We're meeting you where you're at, so that conversation is going to go because of what you need in that moment. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned Robin Williams, and his suicide was obviously because he made a judgment, an assessment with his future medical burden in his family. How does those types of, in this case, moral decisions, how do they hold
It's tough because, yes, so as we discussed today, one of the biggest correlations with suicide death, one of the bigger causal factors they've been able to link is this feeling like a burden on other people. That's why you see really high rates of suicide in like hospices or people who have lifelong medical issues and things of that nature, especially intense medical issues or chronic pain, increase capability because your body is not as afraid of the suicide attempt and you're not as afraid of death. It's really kind of hitting those conversations head on and again getting these ambivalent statements for what they are still attached to life with, but at that point it's also making sure that someone's connected with a therapist who specializes in suicide and in chronic illness or whatever it may be, because it's very real. There are very real stressors like that where it's like, okay, my suicide ideation has me escalating this feeling like a burden, but there also is a very real medical issue and financial issue going on. Same thing will happen with people who are facing evictions, who are facing criminal justice, these types of factors. The thing to remember is that the stress didn't cause the suicide ideation. They are someone who has thoughts of suicide that is now elevated because of this very real stress, and you just got to face it head on, keep having those conversations and get them connected with some specialty care. That would be more, we're not going to just leave this at me being your support system. I'm going to be your support system this whole time, and we'll have real talks, but I need someone that's going to help you untwist some of this burdensome thought. It's just how you would see, like, some people have lifelong illnesses and they never have thoughts of killing themselves, and some people do. It's because some people's brains work that way and some people don't, and you've got to head on get with someone who knows how to untwist those thoughts. But it's tough. Yes.
Do you have a contact card in the case that we need to contact you in the future?
Yes, I do. I'll leave a few.
So, as you know, we are a mentoring organization, and we interact with a lot of young people and a lot of people in their own ages as well. There are times, when we run into kind of volunteer fatigue. You work
Realistic about it. There's a lot of pressure and stress when you are someone who helps other people to feel like I always have to present myself as a superhero because all these people think what I do is great and I must always be great type of thing. Having those real talks within your communities of support, having real sessions of debrief where you can say the things that you might not feel comfortable saying in front of other people that don't get what you really do. Like with 988, we have a very intense debrief system where we have on-call supervisors available 24 hours a day, so they can call us and they can say stuff like, that caller was a real jerk. And I'm glad I helped them, but guess what? I did not like them because of this. You got to be able to get that gunk out, and you have to be able to, the cycle of stress, what it does on our brain, when we don't counter it with good self-care, then that does not have to mean a long bubble bath. That means, did I get to watch the football game I like? Did I get to go take my walk? Did I just do some breathing, re-oxygenate your brain? that undoes the atrophy that stress does to our brain that causes more of these crisis modes and burnout. So really intentional self-care about what works for you specifically, for the specific emotions that you're having, is so important. And just getting that gunk out. Where in your volunteer system and your organization system do you know is the place I get to just let out that ugly stuff when I need to without being judged?
So you're saying if I call from a complaint and I just want to talk because I have compassion to that someone that will listen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. 988 I really like to promote as like, it's an emotional support line. We're always going to ask if you're having thoughts of suicide because we have to, it's in the contract. But if you tell us no, that's not what I need to talk about. We're going to say, oh, okay, well, what's going on? And yeah, we're there to just listen if that's what you need. And just say, I'm burned out through what I'm going through. I need an ear. We'd like lay it on us. And we're there for you. That's an easy call. We love that.
So, quick question about that call, considering culturally the way that reaching out for any type of mental health is perceived in our community. If I make that call, I'm not going to end up on that paperwork. Meaning, I'm calling for emotional help. Is that going on my record? Are they going to start, people going to come to my house? Or am I going to get, people going to think I'm crazy or something's wrong with me? Or what happens?
No, so every call, there's very strict confidentiality compliances when it comes with 988. Now, every state and contact center is different in the way that they operate. There are national standards of like, you would only send someone to someone's house without their permission if it was because they'd already attempted suicide that day right before the call, or because they were going to attempt that day and you cannot de-escalate them. In any case, you should be telling them, like, hey, I'm worried about you. I'm going to send an emergency person to your house. That should be for all Lifeline centers, under 2% of calls that ever happens for.
So what I'm asking though, you just said something that in all the spaces I've been in, I've never heard it couched or marketed like that. Is it just a suicide type prevention line, or is it an emotional support line? So if I'm having a bad day and I call, is it going to go on my record, or is it emotional? Is it one or the other? Or is it both?
It's both. There are internal records that contact centers keep, but we are not allowed to disclose. Even when the police call and say we need to know this, you're not allowed to say anything. You have to fight court subpoenas. We have never released any of our internal records.
And it won't go on a medical record. I'm saying this because this is what we hear. Like, I don't want that on my record. I'm having a bad day.
No, totally. You don't even ever have to tell me.
The insurance companies won't know that
No, you don't have to tell us
I just need to talk to
anything.
them.
You don't even have to tell me your name if you don't want to.
Got it.
I'll know your phone number because you called, and they ask your zip code, and that's only because if it is an emergency where we have to get emergency services to you because a suicide attempt happens, we just kind of need to know which dispatch center to get to. But no, you don't have to tell us your name. You don't have to tell us your address. No 988 center should be asking for confidential information. They should never be asking for like your insurance or Medicaid number or anything like that. So no.
So it's safe for us to go back into our communities and say this is an emotional support day by professionals and it's anonymous and you don't have to worry about it sticking to you.
Right. Now, what I would encourage everyone to do, again, because I can only speak for my center in knowing what the national standards are, is look up who are the contact centers in your state and talk to them directly. And they'll have to tell you, these are the imminent risk guidelines we go by. This is the way. If you came to me or in Louisiana and you said, tell me how it works so I can tell everybody else, we will walk you through the calls, our documentation system, what our imminent risk guidelines look like, everything like that. It's different in different states, but there are national standards, and you have to pass like SOC 2 compliances and all of these tech compliances to keep all of your records confidential, and you're never supposed to demand any sort of identifying information from anybody. So that's why I'm like, you could call me and tell me your name's Earl and you live in Bunkie, Louisiana, when really your name is Timothy and you live in New Orleans. It doesn't matter.
Well, my name is Charles from Jacksonville.
In this day and age, yourself, as you said, you call the main number and you're routed to your local. In this day and age of cell phones, where I'm from Pennsylvania, if I call you from my cell phone 24-2 number,
Right.
How's that work?
So if you know you have an out-of-state area code and you're more comfortable getting to your state, like I encourage Louisianians to ask to be routed to Louisiana because I know our standards, I don't know everybody else's. Whoever picks up on 988, you just say, hey, I'm actually calling from such and such state, can you transfer me there? And they'll do a warm handoff to the 988 center in your state that you're actually in. They have to, it's in all of our contracts, it's our protocol. We all have the procedures on how to get you there.
Okay, so you're not automatically routed to your local,
You're
based
gonna
on your service.
You're gonna
Based
get
on your
routed
area code.
based on your area code. So
Right.
like even if I now live in Delaware, but I still have my Louisiana
Okay,
area
gotcha.
code, I'll get routed to Louisiana, but I can say, hey, I'm actually in Delaware, could you route me there?
Yeah.
They're working on geo routing though, so that it would be more like when you dial 911 and you go to the, it's expensive though. But we just got more funding from the federal level for 988, so yay. Also, should you want to donate to 988, just a call out to all the contact centers, donate to your local one. We do not see national donations. And everybody has to find their own funding.
Any more questions for Sherrod? Sherrod, thank you so much.
So, and I'll leave a stack of my cards, email me.
So due to the fact that sitting is the new standing, we've been sitting for 30 minutes. Can everybody stand up?
Sitting is the new smoking.
So sitting is the new smoking. Yes. Stand up, do a stretch to the right, stretch to the left, shake your legs, wiggle, move. It's been a long day.